brief introduction to the Dzindi Indian, we will look at how we arrive there. After d4, g6, c4, you can see white sets up the pawn duo in the center, very classical. Bishop to g7. We put our bishop on the long diagonal where it aims to put long-term pressure on the d4 pawn. White plays knight to c3. We play c5, and the first three moves are what includes this under the sniper umbrella of openings. This will be part of a larger comprehensive opening system that is very good for black to learn and win a lot of games with. You can see the white pawn on d4 is immediately under pressure. Now, black players could play decline variations like d takes c5. Moves like e3. Moves like knight f3. And just as a quick note on knight f3, takes, and knight c6, you immediately have pressure against d4, and it's not easy for them to reach any kind of favorable Maroczy bind type situation. Black is already very close to equality. Therefore, many players with white at this point will play d5, aggressively gaining space in the center. And that gives us the unique opportunity to play the very surprising bishop takes c3 check exclamation point. Before Roman came out with his videos, this was referred to, and in some places is still referred to as, quote, the beef eater defense. I have no idea why or where that name came from, and I don't even consider it a serious name. To me, after b takes c3, f5 is not a move that computers really like. However, in practice, the point of f5 is that we are fighting for control of the e4 square. You need to think of this Dzindi Indian as a, quote, light square opening, where we give up our dark squares and then we fight white on the light squares. In particular, e4 and c4 are critical light squares. After f5, you can see it becomes a battle of the knights, fighting against pawn weaknesses against the white bishops. You can also see that white has these double pawns that kind of impede the mobility of his bishop pair. Typical plan for black is to play moves like d6, queen a5, knight d7, maybe pop the knight up to e5, either play queen back to a6. Sometimes queen to a6 is useful, and that puts 2 hits on the pawn. Or another method is to play b6 followed by bishop a6. And you can see with very natural moves by black, the white queenside pawns can easily come under attack. And that's what the battle is all about. Quite often the battle is our knight pair against their bishop pair and their weakened pawn structure. In the games ahead, we will look at many examples of white trying to combat our Dzindi Indian and how top players have had continued success with the black pieces. So the very first game was an important encounter. It was played in the World Cup, where they play individual matches. Sergei Karjakin, the 2016 World Championship challenger, was white, rated 2770 against Pavel Lilyanov, 2720, who up to that point had had a great run and beat 2 or 3 other top grandmasters, but in this situation he needed to win with the black pieces. Karjakin opened with knight f3. Black plays c5, c4, g6, d4, and bishop to g7. Very interesting that in a must-win situation, Lilyanov goes with a sniper move order. And here, white makes a surprising choice. You'd think, given the situation, he would play something routine like e3 or knight f3. Not necessarily routine, but a little on the tamer side, if you will. But instead he plays d5. Well, black plays d6, just keeping this diagonal open for just a little bit longer. And he is quickly rewarded when white plays knight to c3. And I think it's very interesting to see what 2650 Grandmaster Jan Gustafsson, commenting for Chess24 Live, said as the game was being played. I have a lot of respect for Jan. And his comment was, quote, "A surprising and doubtful decision, given the situation where black needs to win at all cost. Ilyanov is now able to employ an opening that I was quite fond of in my youth!" Exclamation point. And he says, black now gets what he could only hope for given the situation, the chance to create a strategic imbalance. And of course, Ilyanov jumps all over it and plays bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and f5. So of course, Pavel now welcomes Sergei to the Dzindi Indian. Well, Karjakin plays g3. He opts for the fianchetto plan. But, as mentioned before, this removes a natural defender from the pawn on c4. Black plays knight f6, bishop g2, queen a5, and queen b3. Play continues knight at b to d7, knight to d2, and knight to b6. We can already see the knight starting to eyeball this pawn on c4. In fact, computers even already consider that black has gained full equality. After castles, bishop d7, rook d1. Sergei lines up for the thematic e4 thrust, looking to open the position for his bishop pair. And now a very interesting move, queen to a4. I would have thought maybe to play bishop a4. For example, if queen b2, then probably castles. Note that chasing the pawn this early is probably a bit premature because after e4, fe4, knight e4, well, knight e4, rook e4 not only defends the pawn, but the one way black can lose games in the Dzindzi-Indian is if his king is in the center and he gets nailed on e7. This would be a perfect example of what not to do. However, after castle's queenside, knight g5, you would have rook at d to e8, and the c4 pawn is pretty high and dry. This is one possibility. But the simple castles is much more solid. But Ilyanov played queen a4, which is interesting because you don't really want to exchange on b3 and help meld white's pawns together. So let's see how play develops. Bishop to f1. White should probably seriously consider e4 right away. After f takes, knight takes, rook takes, bishop f5, and then the very nice touch, rook over to h4. From h4, the rook has kingside potential, but lends a natural defender to the c4 square, or actually an unnatural but effective defender to the c4 square. In the game, Karjakin played a little bit passively with bishop f1. And black played very effectively on the light squares, knight to e4. Not only does this hold up the white e-pawn advance, but if we can trade off the knight on d2, another defender of the c4 pawn will have left the board. So the idea, of course, would be takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and knight takes, with clear advantage for black. So after knight e4 exclamation point, white played e3. Well, that solves the problem of defending the c4 pawn. However, look what it does to this bishop on c1. We'll come to that more in a minute. Castles. Of course, castling kingside was also possible, but castling queenside. Bishop to d3. Knight takes, bishop takes, and black plays excellent here with e5. Well, white played f4. Let's just take a quick look. If white tries to do the old en passant, bishop takes, and we can see very thematic idea in this opening. The c4 point is just simply overpowered. and lost. Although white would probably have to play e4 to try and get some counterplay. But even that's probably not enough. So going back to the game after e5, well, white has a beautiful pawn center now. Black has a beautiful pawn duo here, and white felt compelled to play f4. But after f4, e4, the center is now locked up. Let's take a closer look. After e4, black has this very nice pawn chain from h7 to e4 on the light squares. But notice also that the bishop on d2 has now been buried alive by his own pawns. The only hope in the world that guy ever has is that if the g-pawn disappears or advances to g4, getting that guy out here. That is a long, distant hope. But imagine a world-class grandmaster, former world championship challenger, in 17 moves with the white pieces, is sitting there staring at an ugly bishop on d2. This is the kind of thing that happens in the Dzindi-Indian. Well, back to the game, bishop e2. Black plays h6. White plays king f2, and black plays g5. And just as a point, if you need to try and really keep winning chances, you might think about keeping the queens on the board, since you pretty much have a fortress on the queen side, and you don't really want the king side to get locked up. And you have hopes of exploiting the more exposed nature of the white king. But Ilyanov played g5, and after h4, played rook at d to g8. Well, then came rook h1. G takes f4 exclamation point. Black already has a clear advantage. In the game, white played e takes f4. But trying to maintain the symmetrical pawn structure, g takes would then allow queen back, rook at h to g1, bishop a4, queen b1, knight takes on c4, queen over to f1, knight takes d2, rook g8, bishop takes a6, knight takes, bishop takes, and black is a solid pawn ahead and can look forward to serious winning prospects with same colored bishops and rooks on the board. So in the game, after g takes f4, white played e takes f4. Ilyanov played very patiently here with rook g7, but again, queen a6, keeping the queens on the board, or queen a5, thinking to possibly reroute the queen over to the king side. Deserved consideration. After rook g7, then came h5. Rook at h to g8, targeting the g3 point. Rook at h to g1, and then queen a6 exclamation point, keeping the queens on the board. Well, a4. And now Ilyanov hits upon a plan of exploiting the weakness of the pawn on h5, plays bishop e8. After bishop e1, rotates the knight over to d7, king e3, and then knight to f6. We can see the pawn on h5 looking a little bit tender. Well, white had to play rook h1, but already we can envision potential rook takes g3 exchange sacrifices. Or just a simple queen a5. Fritz already considers that black has a minus 1.85 winning advantage based on pawn structure, based on king safety. Amazing. 28 moves. Black has a winning position against a world-class 2770 plus player. Well, bishop f2. b6. Rook h3. King d8. And now comes very strategic, very fine play. King e7. A king walk, right in the middle of the middle game. Bishop f2. King f8. Rook over to e7. And Ilyanov has decided that if he's going to open up the king side, or the queen side, that his king would be safer over on h8. And not a lot white can do about it, because as we can see, white lacks pawn breaks. Well, then came rook h3, queen back to a6, queen to d1, and the shot, knight to g4 check. With his king safely tucked away on h8, Pavel strikes in a timely manner. Of course, the king and dark-squared bishop are forked, which requires you to gasp, give up your good bishop. And I guess after rook takes, Karjakin figured he'd be able to continue barricading in, but then came the surprising capture, pawn takes on g4. This gains a vital tempo and allows black to collect the pawn on c4. After rook h1, queen takes c4. A bishop of opposite color middle game has been reached, where black has an extra pawn. He's got targets on a4, d5, c3, and even h5. He's got the safer king for sure. Look at this king tucked away, snug in the corner. This king out here on e3 in the middle of the board. In fact, the black pawn on e4 is his best defensive piece. Well, black also enjoys superior mobility, as his rooks, bishop, and queen can swing from side to side. And he also enjoys a space advantage conferred on him by the e4 and g4 pawns. A lot of positional trumps. Well, queen e2 trying to trade. Queen takes d5, collecting the second pawn. Rook d1, queen e6, and then c4. Well, with the strategic ship having sunk, Karjakin goes all out and hopes for some peace activity. Probably a very correct, practical approach. Anyway, rook to d7, rook to d5, guarding the pawn on h5, bishop f7 lining up against the rook and the c4 pawn, bishop to e1. Finally, this guy is going to come to life and have a role to play in the game. Well, queen e8, saying hello to the rook on d5. Rook goes on into f5, no time for black, or that is, no time for white to just back up. King h7, getting off the diagonal, and bishop to c3. So finally, Karjakin has managed to activate a couple of his pieces. Bishop e6, rook f6, and then rook f7. Excellent play. A very smart idea. If your opponent has active pieces, especially pieces getting close to your king, you need to trade those things off. Well, rook to g6. White should go for complications with queen to c2. After rook g6, simply rook takes, pawn takes, king takes. Black has a legitimate 3-point material advantage and can be considered to be completely winning at this point. Rook a1, pawn to h5, rook to d1, again targeting the d6 pawn, rook to d7, queen h2, hoping to slide in via h4, and then came queen to d8. Probably stronger was to go ahead and play bishop takes c4 check, and after f5 check, very nice defensive touch, king back on f6, then you play d5, get ready to shut off that bishop, and that will be the end of black's hoped for, white's hoped for counterplay. Once that pawn reaches d4, the steamroller is in process. Take another look. This is move 55, bishop c5, c4, queen h4. You would just meet that with queen to d8. On f5 check, you then take that, don't be afraid. Notice your bishop covers the rook f1 check. Your queen covers the queen f6 mate idea. And after queen check, simply queen check, cross check, trade queens, completely winning. After king e4, you would have rook e7 check, bishop e5 and rook takes e5 mate. And if he does not play king e4, you're ready to just play d4 after d5 and just roll those puppies in for the score. So bishop takes c4 would have been the crowning achievement and would have allowed Ilyanov to go on to the next match. As it was, Karjakin escaped in this match, won the final, and became the 2015 World Cup champion. After queen d8, bishop a1, d5. Again, bishop takes c4 is +5, +5. Easily winning. But d5, pawn takes, rook takes, queen to b2, and then rook to d3 check. Notice, of course, not rook takes d1, queen g7 check. Queen check would be mate. After rook d3 check, king e2. Notice that, of course, king e4, you have the very picturesque bishop to f5 checkmate. Queen d5 also would be mate. Note that if king f2, then very nice touch, queen d4 check, leads to a winning bishop of opposite color endgame, something like this. h4, key idea, sack a pawn to get more passed pawns, push, check, push, and you can see easily winning. So after rook d3 check, Karjakin played king back to e2, but then came queen d4 anyway. And after queen takes, pawn takes, rook takes, very important move, bishop to c4. Very nice, timely pin. After bishop takes d4, pawn takes check, king e3, and now black should execute the win by playing a pawn sack. Instead of king f5 as played in the game, he had pawn to h4. This would have been the moment to create a passed pawn. So after h4 exclamation point, pawn takes, pawn up, king back, we see a very nice role reversal here. The black king goes in to defend the valuable d3 pawn, and the bishop drops back to restrain the white passed pawns. And the way you would win this endgame is as follows. You would now simply walk your king on around, you'd collect the bishop, say you got your king to f1, you'd push the g-pawn, make him give up the bishop, and then it is easy peasy. Instead, black played king f5. After bishop c3, he played a5. After bishop e1, king e6, and then unfortunately, trying to gain time to figure out how to win, horror of horrors, black allowed a threefold repetition. Even though they got there by different move order, what counts is the position, and Karjakin very astutely made the claim, which was upheld by the tournament director, and saving this game allowed him to go on, win the match, and win the next match, and win the 2015 World Cup. But it could have been one of the all-time great achievements in the Dzindi Indian if Ilyanov had managed to finish the task. Nonetheless, extremely instructive game, and some interesting middle game ideas like walking the king over to h8 before breaking through, and the surprising recapture f takes on g4 that allowed him to collect the c4 pawn. The second game we will look at bears a lot of resemblance to the early play of the first game we just saw. And the second game features g3 by white, and was played by my student Ezra online against Arazenga, rated 2200. So let's take a look. d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, knight to f3, c5. Ezra is a true sniper devotee. After d5, he plays d6. Just like Alinov, he keeps the diagonal open for the bishop just a little bit longer. After knight c3, is more than happy to play the Dzindi-Indian with bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes, and f5. So amazingly enough, pretty much the same move order as the Karjakin-Alinov game. This game was played in 2015 as well. Well, white plays g3, knight f6, bishop g2, queen a5, and now instead of queen b3, white played queen c2, guarding the c3 pawn. And after knight at b to d7, castles, and the black knight trots over to b6, attacking the c4 pawn. The white knight hustles back to d2. That does two things. Well, three actually. One, on the downside for white, it boxes in the d2 bishop. Plus side is it defends the c4 pawn and prepares a potential e4 advance. After queen a6, black has two hits on the c4 pawn, and computers consider the position completely equal. Well, in the game, white played queen to d3. But as a Dzindi-Indian player, you always have to think and be prepared on what to do if white plays e4. Here, the variation would look something like this. Knight takes c4, rook e1, threatening to pin, knight to e5 exclamation point, pawn to c4, improving white's pawn structure, f takes, bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes. Notice if rook takes, bishop f5, awkward, and if knight takes, you have knight f3, even worse. So after queen takes, bishop f5, queen h4, then queen a5. But notice this comes with a warning label because, as I said before, the way black can lose games in the Dzindi-Indian is getting tagged on the e7 square with his queen in the center for too long. Now, suppose white plays f4. Black has two ways to fly here. You could play the amazing queen takes d2, hoping for bishop d2, knight check, king takes, knight takes, pawn takes, and king f7 with a clear advantage, better bishop, extra pawn, better pawn structure. But one good turn deserves another, and after the amazing queen d2, white has the equally amazing response, queen takes e7 check, double exclamation point. After king takes, bishop takes, the pin on e5 regains white's pawn. After rook over, pawn takes, king up, the position is considered equal in the endgame. After f4 though, black could also play the very nice queen c3, hitting the rook in the corner. After f takes e5, again, don't take that rook on a1. Let's get the king out of town. And this position is considered slightly better for black. But again, e4, a very complicated but necessary calculation. In the game, white played more routine, queen d3, defended his pawn, black castled, and white played h4. Again, e4 could be met by takes, knight takes, queen takes c4, a little bit of an edge for black. White does have his two bishops, but black has a pretty solid structure, control of the c4 square. In the game, white chose to try and, quote, attack with h4. But bishop d7, rook e1, rook at a to e8. Black's done a great job of centralizing his army. White played f4 question mark. More relevant was to play e4, fe4, knight e4, and then knight to g4. On bishop f4, queen takes c4. Black can claim a slight edge here. But in the game, white played f4. And here black played very nice e6, chipping away at the white pawn center. After pawn takes, rook takes. The idea is you want to double rooks and clamp down on the e4 square if possible. White launched his a-pawn, looking to drive away the knight from b6. Rook at ft8, and on a5, very heads-up play by Ezra. Instead of moving the knight from b6, black noticed that this pawn is actually pinned for a move or two. Instead played bishop c6, exclamation point, all part of the program to gain control of the e4 square. After bishop b2, note that pawn takes, queen takes. Note that bishop takes, pawn takes. And black has a complete clamp down on the e4 and g4 square. What that also, by association, means is that this bishop has now just been buried alive. Well, after bishop b2, have to say that's not a great looking future either, but at least he's threatening to take the knight on b6. But now, Ezra was able to locate the knight to a better spot on d7. After knight f3, rook to e3. White went ahead and nibbled the pawn on d6, but now black crashes through with rook takes, attacking both white bishops. Well, rook takes and rook takes. Black actually has a decisive advantage at this point due to the poor coordination and looseness of the white position. White went in for bishop g5. Well, what would have happened if he would have played the natural-looking move, bishop c1, to defend his unprotected bishop? Well, then comes the tactic. Rook takes check, bishop takes check, and queen takes queen. So in the game, white played knight to g5, hoping to get a little lucky with queen e6 check or something if the rook captures the bishop. But instead, rook takes g2 check, king f1, of course, king h1, you could go all windmill on him. Knight check, 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 and mate next with queen e2. In the game, after king f1, queen takes c4 check, white decided he'd seen enough, because after king e1, queen to e2 would be mate. Very fitting. Mate happens on the light squares. I think we mentioned this is a light square opening. Beautiful execution, well done by Ezra. Moves like e6, and later the very timely bishop to c6 allowed him to relocate the knight. Very nice harmony, nice play on the light squares, gaining control of e4. Ezra did a lot of things we really like in this game. Textbook example of how to play the opening for black.